Sometimes a single moment of courage can rewrite two destinies forever. Sometimes the person society overlooks carries the very skills the world desperately needs. When homeless single father Marklord Barbas pulls a CEO's daughter from a blazing apartment building, neither he nor the powerful woman realizes they're about to discover that true worth has nothing to do with bank accounts, and everything to do with the secrets we carry in our hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist rolled off San Francisco Bay like a gentle blessing, but Marklord Barbas couldn't afford to appreciate beauty when survival demanded every ounce of his attention. He adjusted the worn backpack containing everything he and his 8-year-old daughter Lucia owned in the world, checking to make sure his most precious possession, a faded photo of his late wife Carmen in her paramedic uniform, remained safely tucked in the front pocket. "Papa, are we going to find a place to sleep tonight?" Lucia's voice was small but brave, the kind of courage that broke Marklord's heart because no child should need to summon it so often. Marklord knelt down to meet his daughter's eyes, those same warm brown eyes that reminded him so much of Carmen. "We always figure it out, Maisha. We're survivors, remember?" The truth was more complicated. 6 months ago, Marklord had been Captain Marklord Barbas of the Riverside County Fire Department, one of the youngest men ever to lead a station. He'd commanded respect from his crew, saved countless lives, and earned commendations that lined the walls of what used to be their home. But when Carmen died in that ambulance crash, responding to a call he'd radioed in, everything unraveled. The guilt consumed him. The nightmares made sleep impossible. The bottle became his only escape until it cost him everything: his badge, his home, his sense of worth. Now he walked the streets of Meridian Heights, an upscale San Francisco neighborhood where his firefighter's pension couldn't even cover a month's rent. He'd pawned his medals, sold Carmen's car, and watched their savings disappear into the bottomless pit of grief and poor decisions. What remained was muscle memory. The ability to read smoke patterns, assess structural integrity, and move through chaos with practiced calm. Skills that seemed worthless when you couldn't even provide your child with a permanent bed. "Look, Papa," Lucia pointed towards Celestial Towers, a gleaming residential complex that housed some of the city's wealthiest families. "The building looks like it's smoking." Marklord's head snapped up, his trained eyes immediately assessing what others might dismiss as morning fog. But he knew the difference. The grayish wisps curling from the 15th floor weren't vapor. They were smoke. And where there was smoke in a high-rise apartment building at 7 a.m., there was usually trouble brewing fast. His firefighter instincts kicked in automatically. "Lucia, I need you to stay right here by this bench. Don't move, understand?" "But Papa, promise me." Marklord's voice carried the authority that had once commanded a firehouse. "If anything happens, you run to that corner store and tell them to call 911. Can you do that for me?" Lucia nodded solemnly, recognizing the tone that meant her father had shifted into the person he used to be, the hero who saved people. Marklord approached the building's pristine lobby, where a security guard sat behind a marble desk, scrolling through his phone with the bored expression of someone who'd never encountered a real emergency. The contrast between his pressed uniform and Marklord's thrift store clothes was stark, but Marklord had learned to ignore such things. "Excuse me, there's smoke coming from the 15th floor," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. The guard barely looked up. Probably just someone cooking breakfast. These rich folks burn toast all the time. Marklord's jaw tightened. In his experience, people who dismissed potential danger usually learned to regret it. "I'm telling you, that's not cooking smoke. You need to check on whoever lives up there." "Look, buddy." The guard finally raised his eyes, taking in Marklord's worn clothes and weathered backpack with obvious disdain. "I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but residents of Celestial Towers don't appreciate vagrants hanging around the lobby. Why don't you move along before I call the cops?" The dismissal stung, but Marklord had endured worse. He was about to argue when the building's fire alarm began shrieking through the lobby speakers, its piercing wail confirming what his trained nose had already detected. The guard's face went pale as emergency lights began flashing throughout the elegant space. Through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, Marklord could see smoke now pouring more heavily from multiple windows on the 15th floor. His firefighter's brain automatically calculated wind patterns, structural vulnerabilities, and evacuation routes. This wasn't a minor kitchen fire. This was a rapidly escalating emergency that would overwhelm the building's safety systems within minutes. The guard fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking as reality set in. Dispatch, we might have a situation on 15. Should I evacuate the building?" Marklord interrupted, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd managed dozens of similar crises. "Now. And call the fire department immediately." As if to punctuate his words, the first tendrils of smoke began seeping down the stairwell, visible through the glass doors that separated the lobby from the emergency exits. Marklord's mind raced through the calculations he'd made thousands of times before. Response time from Meridian Heights Fire Department would be at least 8 minutes in morning traffic. In a high-rise fire, 8 minutes could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. He thought of Lucia waiting outside, thought of the comfortable life they'd lost, thought of Carmen's voice telling him that a firefighter's duty didn't end when the uniform came off. Some instincts ran deeper than pride, deeper than shame, deeper than the fear of being rejected again. Marklord Barbas, former fire captain turned homeless father, was about to remember exactly who he'd been before the world fell apart. And somewhere on the 15th floor, Vivian Ashford, daughter of tech mogul Catherine Ashford, was about to discover that angels sometimes came disguised as the people society chose to ignore. The real test was just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The chaos in Celestial Tower's lobby erupted like a carefully orchestrated symphony of panic. Residents in silk pajamas and designer robes streamed from the elevators and stairwells, their morning routines shattered by the harsh reality of emergency alarms. But while everyone else moved with the frantic energy of people unaccustomed to real danger, Marklord Barbas stood perfectly still, his weathered face a mask of professional calm as he processed information that could mean the difference between life and death. "Lucia, remember what I taught you," he called to his daughter, who had pressed herself against the lobby's glass wall, her small hands flat against the cool surface as she watched her father transform before her eyes. For 8 years, she'd known him as Papa, the man who told bedtime stories about brave firefighters and made breakfast from whatever they could afford. But now she was seeing Captain Barbas, the man her mother Carmen used to describe with such pride. Marklord's mind automatically cataloged the evacuation chaos. Approximately 40 residents, mostly elderly or families with young children. The building's fire suppression system was engaged, but the alarms indicated it was already overwhelmed. Smoke was beginning to drift down from the upper floors, and the elevator shafts would soon become chimneys, funneling heat and toxic gases throughout the structure. "Sir, we need to get everyone out through the main exits," the security guard stammered, finally understanding the gravity of the situation he'd initially dismissed. "No," Marklord said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "Look at the smoke patterns. The fire's directly above the main lobby. In about 10 minutes, this entire area will be compromised. We need to use the service exits on the east side." The guard stared at him in confusion. "How do you know all this?" Before Marklord could answer, a woman's voice cut through the chaos from the building's intercom system. "This is Catherine Ashford in the penthouse. My daughter Vivian is trapped on the 15th floor. The elevators are down and the stairwell is full of smoke. Someone please." The transmission cut to static. Marklord felt his chest tighten. Catherine Ashford, he recognized the name. Technova Industries, one of the largest companies in the Bay Area. Her penthouse would be on the 20th floor, probably equipped with its own helicopter pad for emergencies. But her daughter was 15 floors below, in the heart of the fire zone. "Papa?" Lucia's voice was small, frightened. She could see the familiar change in her father's posture, the way his shoulders straightened and his jaw set with determination. It was the same look he'd worn in the photo on their makeshift bedside table. The one where he stood with his fire crew after saving 3 children from a house fire in Oakland. Marklord knelt beside his daughter, taking her small hands in his calloused ones. "Meja, I need to tell you something important. Do you remember the stories I used to tell you about your mama, about how she saved people?" Lucia nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. "Your papa used to save people too. That's what I did before everything changed." His voice carried the weight of memories he'd tried to bury. There's a girl upstairs who needs help, and I might be the only person here who knows how to get to her safely. Are you going to leave me? The question that haunted every conversation, every decision since Carmen's death. Marklord cupped his daughter's face gently. I will never leave you, Lucia. But sometimes being a good papa means doing scary things to help other people. Your mama taught me that. She said that when you have the power to save someone, you don't get to choose whether it's convenient or safe, you just do it. Around them, the evacuation continued in increasingly panicked disorder. Marklord could see that the building's staff were overwhelmed, following procedures designed for minor emergencies, not the rapidly escalating inferno developing above their heads. In his professional estimation, they had maybe 20 minutes before the 15th floor became completely inaccessible. He pulled out his phone, a battered device held together with electrical tape, and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, he didn't identify himself as a former captain. That life was over. But the knowledge remained. This is Marklord Barbas, calling from Celestial Towers on Meridian Boulevard. You have a working structure fire, high-rise, with confirmed entrapment on the 15th floor. The building's suppression system is overwhelmed, and you're going to need ladder trucks and aerial rescue. Estimated response time? Sir, are you emergency personnel? Marklord hesitated for just a moment. I have firefighting experience. What's your ETA? First units are en route. Estimated arrival 12 to 15 minutes due to traffic conditions. Too long, far too long. By the time the fire department navigated San Francisco's morning gridlock and set up their equipment, Vivian Ashford would likely be dead from smoke inhalation, even if the fire didn't reach her directly. Lucia, Marklord said, standing and shouldering his backpack, I need you to go with Mrs. Chen from the corner store. Remember her? The nice lady who sometimes gives you crackers? But Papa. Listen to me, Mija. Mrs. Chen will keep you safe while I help the girl upstairs. And when I come down, we'll have a story to tell about the day Papa remembered how to be a hero again. As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Chen appeared in the lobby, having seen the commotion from her store window. The elderly woman had watched Marklord and Lucia sleep in doorways, had offered them food when she could afford it, and had never once made them feel like burdens. Mr. Barbas, she said in accented English, what can I do to help? Keep Lucia safe, he replied simply. And if I don't come back down? You will, Mrs. Chen interrupted firmly. Heroes always come home to their children. Your wife told you that, yes? Marklord's eyes filled with unexpected tears. Carmen had said exactly those words the night before her final shift. He nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. As Mrs. Chen led Lucia toward the emergency exit, Marklord Barbas looked up at the smoke-filled stairwell that led to the 15th floor. Somewhere above, a young woman was waiting for a rescue that might never come. He thought of his daughter's trusting eyes, of Carmen's belief in doing what was right regardless of the cost, of the man he used to be before grief and guilt had stripped away everything except his fundamental nature. The hero was still there, buried under months of pain and loss. It was time to let him out. The stairwell of Celestial Towers felt like entering the mouth of a dragon. Heat radiated from the concrete walls, and smoke hung in the air like a malevolent fog, testing every breath Marklord took as he began his ascent toward the 15th floor. His makeshift gear, a wet towel wrapped around his face, his jacket soaked with water from the lobby's decorative fountain, felt primitive compared to the full breathing apparatus he'd once worn into situations like this. But primitive didn't mean ineffective. Marklord had learned during his years with Riverside County that improvisation often meant the difference between successful rescue and tragic failure. He moved up the stairs with practiced efficiency, staying low where the air was cleaner, testing each step for structural integrity, reading the smoke like a roadmap that told him exactly where the fire was spreading and how fast. Floor 7. The smoke was getting thicker, but the stairwell remained passable. Through the small window in the fire door, he could see that this level appeared clear. Residents had evacuated successfully, leaving behind the detritus of hasty departure. A child's stuffed animal lay abandoned near the elevator bank, and Marklord felt a sharp pang thinking of Lucia waiting with Mrs. Chen. Floor 10. Now the heat was becoming serious. Marklord could feel it through his wet clothing, and he knew that meant the fire was directly above, probably concentrated around floors 12 through 14. The building's ventilation system was working against them, drawing the superheated air upward and creating a chimney effect that would make the upper floors increasingly dangerous with each passing minute. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Chen. "Lucia safe. Fire trucks arriving. She says tell Papa that heroes come home." The message gave him strength but also added pressure. Professional firefighters would be here soon, but they'd face the same time constraints he did, plus the additional minutes needed to set up equipment and assess the situation. Vivian Ashford didn't have those minutes to spare. Floor 13. This was where everything changed. The fire door felt hot to the touch when Marklord tested it with the back of his hand, a basic technique that had saved countless firefighters from walking into flashover conditions. Behind this door, the hallway was likely compromised, filled with superheated gases that could ignite explosively the moment they encountered fresh oxygen. But floor 15 was just 2 more flights up. Marklord pressed on, his breathing controlled despite the increasingly toxic air. The wet towel over his face was doing its job, but he could feel his lungs beginning to protest. In his active days, he would have had a full face mask and bottled air. Now he had determination and the muscle memory of 1,000 emergency responses. Floor 14. The heat was nearly unbearable now. Through the fire door's window, Marklord could see the angry orange glow of active flames. This floor was lost. The fire had claimed it completely. But that also meant something important. If the fire was consuming floor 14, it hadn't yet reached 15. There was still time, still hope. The final flight of stairs felt like climbing through hell itself. Each step required conscious effort as the superheated air tried to rob him of strength and clarity. Marklord's firefighter training kicked in completely now. He wasn't thinking about his homeless situation, his lost career, or his fears about the future. He was simply Captain Barbas, moving through a burning building with a mission to complete. Floor 15. The fire door was warm, but not hot, promising, but not definitive. Marklord pressed his ear against it, listening for the telltale roar of active fire, or the crackling of materials reaching their ignition point. What he heard instead was something that made his heart race. A woman's voice, weak but audible, calling for help. "Hello, is someone there? Please, I can't get the door open." Marklord tested the door handle carefully. The mechanism turned, but the door wouldn't budge. Either warped by heat or blocked by debris, the emergency exit to the 15th floor was sealed. But firefighters learned early that there was always another way. You just had to be creative enough to find it. Moving back down half a flight, Marklord examined the building's construction with professional eyes. Celestial Towers was built to luxury standards, which meant solid materials, but also meant predictable layouts. The building would have service access points, utility rooms, and maintenance passages that most people never noticed, but that emergency responders studied religiously. There, a small door marked utility access that he'd passed on his way up. Marklord forced it open with his shoulder, revealing a narrow maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the main hallways. The space was cramped, filled with pipes and electrical conduits, but it was also largely protected from the main fire. More importantly, it would have access panels to the residential floors. Crawling through the utility corridor, Marklord felt like he was moving through the building's circulatory system. His phone's flashlight revealed a maze of building infrastructure, but also showed him exactly what he needed. A service panel marked 15A, with a small access door that would open into the 15th floor hallway. The voice was clearer now, coming from what sounded like an apartment near the elevator bank. "Please, somebody help me. The smoke is getting worse." Marklord forced open the service panel and emerged into a hallway that looked like a scene from a disaster movie. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through a haze of smoke that was growing thicker by the minute. The carpet was smoldering in places, and he could see that some of the ceiling tiles had begun to warp from the heat rising from below. But the hallway was passable, at least for now. Following the voice, Marklord moved toward apartment 15C, where he could see light seeping under the door. He knocked firmly but controlled, loud enough to be heard, but not hard enough to potentially compromise a door that might be all that stood between its occupant and deadly conditions in the hallway. "I'm here to help. Are you injured?" "No, but I can't get out. The door is stuck, and there's so much smoke I can barely breathe." Marklord examined the door and immediately saw the problem. The building's fire suppression system had warped the door frame just enough to jam the mechanism. Under normal circumstances, this would be a minor inconvenience. In a fire emergency, it was potentially fatal. "Step away from the door," he called. "I'm gonna get you out." Using techniques learned in countless forced entry training sessions, Marklord applied pressure at the door's weak points. The expensive materials that made celestial towers luxurious also made them predictable. He knew exactly where the frame would give way. The door burst open, and Marklord found himself face to face with a young woman in her mid-20s, her designer pajamas and perfectly styled hair incongruous with the terror in her eyes. This had to be Vivian Ashford, Catherine Ashford's daughter, trapped in a world of privilege that had never prepared her for anything like this moment. "Who are you?" she gasped, staring at his smoke-stained clothes and improvised breathing protection. "Someone who's going to get you out of here," Marklord replied, already assessing their escape options. "But we need to move now. Can you walk?" Vivian nodded, though her legs seemed unsteady. Shock, probably, combined with early smoke inhalation. Marklord had seen it before. People who functioned normally until the moment rescue arrived, then fell apart as adrenaline gave way to the reality of their situation. "What's your name?" he asked, partly to keep her focused, and partly because he'd learned that knowing someone's name made them easier to save. "Vivian," she whispered. "Vivian Ashford. My mother, she's in the penthouse. She knows I'm here." "I know. She's the one who called for help." "We're gonna get you to her, but first we have to get out of this building. Do you trust me?" Vivian looked at this homeless stranger who had appeared like an answer to prayer, taking in his confident manner and the way he moved through the emergency with practiced ease. Something in his voice, some note of absolute certainty, made her nod. "Good. Stay close, do exactly what I say, and we're both going home safely." As they prepared to leave apartment 15C, Marklord Barbas made a decision that would change both their lives forever. This rescue was about more than just getting Vivian Ashford out of a burning building. It was about proving, to himself, to his daughter, to the world, that who you are isn't determined by where you sleep at night, but by what you do when someone else's life hangs in the balance. The real test was just beginning. The descent from the 15th floor became a masterclass in controlled chaos. Marklord guided Vivian through the smoke-filled stairwell with the precision of someone who had navigated countless similar emergencies, but each step downward revealed new challenges that tested every skill he'd accumulated during his years as a fire captain. "Stay behind me and keep one hand on my shoulder," Marklord instructed, his voice muffled by the wet towel but still carrying absolute authority. "If I stop, suddenly you stop. If I go down, you go down. We move as one unit." Vivian, who had spent her entire life in environments where other people solved problems for her, found herself completely dependent on this stranger whose name she didn't even know. Her designer pajamas were already soaked with perspiration and grime, her carefully maintained appearance dissolving in the harsh reality of smoke and heat. But something about Marklord's calm competence made her feel safer than she had since the alarms first started blaring. Floor 14 was a hellscape. Through the fire door's window, they could see flames dancing across what had once been an elegant hallway, consuming expensive artwork and handcrafted furniture with democratic indifference. The heat radiating through the glass was so intense that Vivian instinctively stepped back, but Marklord held steady, studying the fire's behavior with professional interest. "It's moving toward the elevators," he observed, more to himself than to her. "Good. That means the service corridor route is still clear." "How do you know so much about fires?" Vivian asked, her voice tight with fear and growing curiosity about this man who seemed as comfortable in a burning building as most people felt in their living rooms. Marklord hesitated for just a moment. His past was a wound he'd kept carefully hidden, even from well-meaning people like Mrs. Chen, who had helped him and Lucia survive on the streets. But here, in this moment of absolute crisis, the truth felt less like vulnerability and more like necessity. "I used to be a firefighter," he said simply, continuing their descent, "before I lost everything." The admission hung in the smoky air between them as they navigated the increasingly treacherous stairwell. Vivian processed this information with the rapid mental calculations that came from growing up around powerful people who rarely revealed their complete stories on first meeting. "What happened?" she asked, then immediately wondered if the question was inappropriate given their circumstances. "My wife died," Marklord replied, his voice carrying the weight of grief that had never fully healed. "She was a paramedic, responded to a call I radioed in. The ambulance crashed on the way to the scene." He paused their descent to check the conditions at floor 12. After that, I couldn't do the job anymore. Couldn't trust my judgment when other people's lives depended on it. Vivian found herself studying this man with new eyes. She had grown up around successful people, leaders of industry and finance who wore their achievements like armor. But she had never met someone who had deliberately walked away from their calling because of conscience, because the weight of responsibility had become too heavy to bear. "But you're here now," she pointed out, "risking your life for someone you don't even know." Marklord managed a grim smile as they continued downward. "Sometimes you don't get to choose when your past catches up with you." Floor 11 brought a new challenge. The stairwell, which had been merely difficult to navigate, was now partially blocked by debris that had fallen from the ceiling. Water from the building's sprinkler system had mixed with smoke and ash to create a slippery, treacherous surface that made each step potentially fatal. "This is where it gets complicated," Marklord said, examining the obstacle. Twisted metal and chunks of concrete had created a narrow passage that would require them to crawl through a space barely large enough for one person at a time. Vivian stared at the opening with growing panic. "I can't. I don't think I can fit through there." "Yes, you can," Marklord said with absolute certainty. "I've seen people do much harder things when their lives depended on it. You're stronger than you think." He demonstrated the technique, showing her how to move through the debris without cutting herself on jagged metal or destabilizing the pile. His movements were economical, practiced, the muscle memory of someone who had crawled through countless damaged structures. "Your turn," he said from the other side of the obstruction. "Take your time, but don't hesitate. Hesitation is what gets people hurt." Vivian approached the narrow opening with the same trepidation she'd once felt before her first board presentation at Technova. But this was different. This was survival, pure and simple. She thought about her mother waiting in the penthouse, probably pacing the helicopter pad, and demanding updates from emergency responders who had no updates to give. The crawl through the debris took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Sharp edges caught at her pajamas, and the confined space triggered a claustrophobia she hadn't known she possessed. But Marklord's steady voice guided her through, and when she emerged on the other side, she realized something fundamental had changed. For the first time in her privileged life, Vivian Ashford had done something that required real courage. "Well done," Marklord said, and she could hear genuine respect in his voice. "How do you feel?" "Terrified," she admitted, "but also, I don't know. Different." "That's what real accomplishment feels like," he replied. "When you do something you didn't think you could do, it changes how you see yourself." Floor 9 marked another transition in their descent. The immediate danger of the fire was behind them, but the building's structural integrity was becoming questionable. Marklord could feel vibrations in the stairwell that suggested the floors above were beginning to shift, as supporting beams weakened under extreme heat. "We need to move faster now," he said, increasing their pace. "This building is going to start coming apart soon." "How much farther?" Vivian asked, her initial adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. 6 more floors. But those 6 floors are going to be the hardest part." As if to emphasize his point, the building's fire alarm system began emitting a different pattern of sounds, longer blasts that Marklord recognized as the signal for structural compromise. Emergency responders would be receiving warnings about potential collapse, which meant their window for escape was rapidly closing. Floor 7 brought voices echoing up the stairwell. The San Francisco Fire Department had finally arrived and was beginning their own ascent. Marklord felt a mixture of relief and professional pride, hearing the familiar sounds of coordinated emergency response. The hiss of breathing apparatus, the clank of tools, the calm radio chatter of teams moving into position. "SFFD, anyone in the stairwell?" a voice called up from below. "2 civilians descending from 15, Marklord shouted back. "Female victim, good condition. No injuries." "Copy that. Continue descent and report to command when you reach lobby level." Vivian looked at him with something approaching awe. "They talk to you like you're one of them." "I was one of them," Marklord replied. "Still am, I guess. Some things you never really stop being." Floor 5. Floor 4. Floor 3. With each level, the air became cleaner and breathing easier. Vivian's initial terror had transformed into something else, a kind of exhilaration that came from surviving something she hadn't thought she could survive. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they approached floor 2. "Sure. What's your name? I've been calling you my rescuer in my head, but you must have an actual name." Marklord paused, realizing that in all the chaos of the rescue, they had never completed the basic human ritual of introduction. "Marklord Barbas," he said. "And you're Vivian Ashford, daughter of Catherine Ashford, CEO of Technova Industries. How did you know that?" "Your mother's announcement over the building's intercom system. She was trying to get help for you." They had reached the ground floor. Through the fire door, Marklord could see the organized chaos of emergency response. Paramedics setting up triage areas, fire commanders coordinating with building management, police establishing perimeters. In a few seconds, they would walk through that door and return to their respective worlds. He to homelessness and uncertainty, she to wealth and privilege. But something had changed during their descent. Two strangers had shared an experience that stripped away all the surface differences between them, revealing the fundamental human capacity for courage, trust, and mutual respect. "Marklord," Vivian said quietly, her hand still resting on his shoulder as they prepared to rejoin the world. "Thank you, not just for saving my life, but for showing me what real strength looks like." Marklord Barbas, homeless single father and former fire captain, looked at this young woman who had discovered something about herself in the stairwell of a burning building. He thought about Lucia waiting outside with Mrs. Chen, about the life they were trying to build from the wreckage of their past, about the man he had been, and the man he might yet become again. "Thank you for reminding me who I used to be," he replied. Then he opened the door, and they stepped together into whatever came next. The lobby of Celestial Towers had transformed into a command center that would have impressed any emergency management professional. Paramedics moved with practiced efficiency between triage stations, fire commanders coordinated radio traffic from multiple agencies, and building management personnel provided blueprints and system information to anyone who needed it. The chaos was organized, purposeful, and completely overwhelming to someone who had spent the last 6 months invisible to the very system, now working to save lives. Marklord emerged from the stairwell with Vivian, immediately spotting the incident commander, a woman in her 40s whose gear and bearing marked her as someone who had worked her way up through the ranks the hard way. Captain Sarah Rodriguez, according to her helmet, and she was scanning the lobby with the kind of systematic attention that Marklord recognized from his own days running emergency scenes. "Captain Rodriguez?" Marklord approached with the careful deference of someone who understood chain of command. "Marklord Barbas, reporting with civilian evacuee from floor 15. Rodriguez looked up from her clipboard, taking in Marklord's smoke-stained appearance and improvised protective gear. Her expression was professional but curious. Something about his manner didn't match his obvious homeless status. "Medical evaluation first," she directed, pointing toward a paramedic station. "Then debriefing. We need to know what you saw up there." As they moved toward the medical area, Vivian found herself studying the organized response with new appreciation. These people were doing exactly what Marklord had done for her, putting themselves at risk to help strangers. But he had done it alone, without backup, without proper equipment, guided only by knowledge and conscience. "Vivian!" A voice cut through the emergency chatter like a blade. Catherine Ashford swept across the lobby with the commanding presence that had made her one of the most powerful CEOs in Silicon Valley. Her usually perfect appearance showed signs of stress, hair slightly disheveled, makeup smudged from what were probably tears of relief. The reunion between mother and daughter was fierce, desperate, the kind of embrace that happened when people realized how close they had come to permanent loss. Marklord watched from a respectful distance while a paramedic checked his vital signs and examined his eyes for smoke damage. "Sir, you've got some minor smoke inhalation, but nothing serious," the paramedic reported. "Your technique for breathing protection was pretty good. You have medical training." "Some," Marklord replied evasively. He was watching Catherine Ashford, studying the woman whose desperate announcement had set this entire rescue in motion. She was younger than he had expected, probably early 50s, with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested someone accustomed to solving problems through will and resources. "Mom, this is Marklord Barbas," Vivian said, leading her mother toward the medical station. "He saved my life. He came up 15 floors through smoke and fire to get me out." Catherine's gaze fell on Marklord with the focused attention she usually reserved for critical business decisions. She was clearly trying to reconcile his appearance, worn clothes, weathered hands, the unmistakable markers of someone living rough with the heroic action her daughter was describing. "Mr. Barbas," she said, extending her hand with the same firm grip she used in boardrooms, "I cannot begin to express my gratitude. How can I possibly repay you for what you've done?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marklord had spent months being invisible to people like Catherine Ashford, existing in the spaces between their awareness and their conscience. Now, one of the most powerful women in the city was asking how she could repay him, and he genuinely didn't know how to answer. "I don't need repayment," he said finally. "I have a daughter. I understand what it means to worry about someone you love." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "You have a daughter? Where is she now?" "Safe," Marklord replied, "with a friend, waiting for me to come home." The word, home, carried weight that Catherine couldn't miss. She had built an empire on reading between the lines, on understanding what people weren't saying as much as what they were. Marklord Barbas had no home in any conventional sense, yet he spoke of going home to his daughter with the same certainty other fathers spoke of returning to their suburban houses. "Mr. Barbas," Captain Rodriguez approached, having finished coordinating with her teams. "I need to ask you some questions about the conditions upstairs. Your information could be critical for our recovery operations." For the next 20 minutes, Marklord provided the kind of detailed incident report that impressed everyone within earshot. He described temperature variations by floor, structural concerns he had observed, the progression of the fire, and the condition of various escape routes, with the precision of someone who had written hundreds of similar reports. "You've got excellent observational skills," Rodriguez noted, making detailed notes. "Professional level, really. What's your background?" The question Marklord had been dreading finally arrived. Around him, he could sense the attention of paramedics building security, and most importantly, Catherine and Vivian Ashford. His past was about to be exposed to people who had already seen him at his most vulnerable and most heroic. "I was a fire captain," he said quietly, "Riverside County, before I lost everything." The admission created a ripple of understanding through the group. Suddenly, his competence made sense, his willingness to risk his life for a stranger, his calm navigation through emergency conditions that would have paralyzed most civilians. "Captain Barbas," Rodriguez said, her tone shifting to one of professional respect. "I know Riverside County. Good department. What happened?" Marklord looked at Vivian, who was watching him with the same intense curiosity she had shown in the stairwell. She had trusted him with her life. Perhaps it was time to trust her with his truth. "My wife was a paramedic. She died responding to a call I had radioed in. After that, I couldn't do the job anymore. Started drinking, lost my commission, lost our house. Been on the streets with my daughter for 6 months now." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable but respectful. These were people who understood that tragedy could reshape anyone's life in ways that defied easy explanation or judgment. "Captain," Rodriguez said finally, "I don't know your full situation, but if you're ever interested in getting back into emergency services, I'd be happy to make some calls. We can always use experienced people." Catherine Ashford had been listening to this exchange with the kind of focused attention she brought to strategic planning sessions. Her daughter had been saved by a homeless former fire captain, who had lost everything but retained his fundamental character. It was exactly the kind of complexity that challenged simple narratives about success and failure. "Mr. Barbas," she said, "or should I say Captain Barbas, I meant what I said about repayment. You saved my daughter's life. That creates an obligation I take very seriously. I told you, I don't need. What you need and what you deserve might be different things," Catherine interrupted with the gentle firmness that had made her successful in business. "At minimum, I'd like to help you get back on your feet. You and your daughter both." Marklord felt the familiar surge of pride that had kept him from accepting charity for months. But looking at Vivian, who was watching their conversation with obvious hope, he realized this wasn't about charity. This was about recognition, acknowledgement that his actions had value, that his skills mattered, that his life had worth beyond his current circumstances. "I have a daughter to consider," he said carefully. "Whatever I decide affects her too." "Of course," Catherine replied. "I'd like to meet her, if you're comfortable with that, and I'd like to discuss some possibilities that might interest you both." Across the lobby, Marklord could see through the glass doors to where Mrs. Chen sat on a bench with Lucia, both of them watching the emergency response with anxious eyes. His daughter had been waiting for hours to see if her papa would come home, trusting in the promise that heroes always return to their children. "Captain Barbas," Vivian said quietly, "whatever my mother is offering, please consider it. Not because you need help, but because people like you, people who risk everything for others, deserve to have others risk something for them." Marklord looked at this young woman who had emerged from a burning building as someone fundamentally different from the person who had entered it. She was offering him something he hadn't dared hope for, the possibility that his worst day might not define the rest of his life. "All right," he said finally. "I'll listen to what you have to propose." Catherine Ashford smiled, not the practiced expression she used in business meetings, but the genuine relief of someone who had found a way to repay an unpayable debt. "Excellent. But first I think there's someone outside who's been waiting quite long enough to see her hero come home." As Marklord walked toward the lobby doors where Lucia waited, he realized that the real rescue might just be beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Willowbrook Apartments as Marklord stood in the doorway of what would be their new home, watching Lucia explore the two-bedroom unit with the wide-eyed wonder of a child who had almost forgotten what permanent shelter felt like. 3 days had passed since the fire at Celestial Towers. 3 days of conversations that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of their lives. "Papa, look," Lucia called from what would be her bedroom, her voice echoing in the empty space. "I can see the playground from my window, and there's a library across the street." Marklord smiled, running his hand along the doorframe with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take solid walls for granted. The apartment was modest by Catherine Ashford's standards, but it represented luxury beyond measure for a father and daughter who had been sleeping in doorways and shelter cots for 6 months. The transition from the streets to stable housing was more complex than most people understood. It wasn't just about having a roof and running water, though those things were precious beyond words. It was about the psychological adjustment to believing that safety might actually last, that this wasn't just a temporary reprieve before the next crisis arrived. Catherine had offered much more, of course. A house in an exclusive neighborhood, private schools, immediate integration into the social circles where her daughter moved with natural ease. But Marklord had declined those offers with the same quiet dignity that had characterized all his interactions with the Ashford family. "I need to earn my way back," he had explained during their second meeting, held in Catherine's corporate office while Lucia played with Vivian in the adjacent conference room. "My daughter needs to see me build something, not just accept something built for me." What they had agreed upon was more subtle and potentially more valuable, a position as emergency preparedness consultant for Technova Industries, with a mandate to develop disaster response protocols for the company's 15 office buildings throughout California. The salary was generous without being overwhelming. The work would utilize his expertise without requiring him to return to active firefighting, and the title carried enough dignity to help rebuild the professional identity that had been shattered, along with everything else. "Mr. Barbas?" The voice belonged to Jennifer Walsh, the property manager who had been expecting them. She was a woman in her late 30s with the efficient manner of someone who had dealt with every conceivable housing situation, but her expression suggested she was curious about the circumstances that had brought a formerly homeless father to sign a lease, backed by one of the city's most powerful executives. "Just Marklord," he replied, accepting the keys with hands that still bore the calluses of his firefighting years. "And thank you for accommodating our unusual situation." Jennifer had indeed accommodated an unusual situation. Catherine had paid the first year's rent in advance, along with security deposit and utility connections, but the lease was in Marklord's name alone. The message was clear. This was his home, his responsibility, his opportunity to rebuild rather than simply be rescued. "Lucia seems like a wonderful little girl," Jennifer observed, watching through the window as the 8-year-old continued her exploration of their new home. "The elementary school here is excellent, and the after-school program has a great reputation." School. The word carried weight that Marklord was still processing. For months, Lucia's education had been a patchwork of library visits, educational apps on his phone, and the kind of street wisdom no child should need to acquire. Now she would have classrooms, teachers, friends, who didn't need to worry about where they would sleep each night. "She's excited about starting fresh," Marklord said. "New school, new friends, new opportunities to just be a kid again." What he didn't say was how terrified he was of failing again, of somehow losing this chance and putting Lucia back into the uncertainty they had just escaped. Success felt more frightening than survival had been. Survival was familiar territory, while success carried expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "How's the move going? Vivian wants to know if Lucia would like to join her for lunch this weekend." The developing friendship between Vivian and Lucia had been one of the unexpected gifts of their new circumstances. Despite the 20-year age gap and vastly different backgrounds, the two had connected over shared experience of crisis and the peculiar bond that formed between people who had faced genuine danger together. Vivian had been present during Lucia's first meeting with Catherine, serving as translator between the adult world of corporate negotiations and the child's world of simple needs. "Tell Miss Vivian that Lucia would love that," Marklord texted back, then called to his daughter. "Lucia, come help me figure out where we want to put our things." Their possessions fit easily into the apartment's storage spaces. Months of homelessness had taught them to value only what could be carried, only what served multiple purposes, only what couldn't be replaced if lost. The photo of Carmen, Marklord's father's tools, Lucia's few treasured books, some clothes donated by various charities, their entire material existence could be inventoried in minutes. But poverty of possessions didn't mean poverty of hope. As they arranged their meager belongings in the furnished apartment, Marklord felt something he hadn't experienced since before Carmen's death. The sense that tomorrow might be better than today. "Papa," Lucia said as they set up her small collection of books on the bedroom shelf, "do you think Mama would be proud of us?" The question hit him with unexpected force. For months, his grief had been tangled up with guilt, with the conviction that Carmen's death had been somehow connected to his professional decisions, that her loss was evidence of his fundamental failure as a husband and protector. But watching Lucia arrange her books with careful precision, seeing her excitement about starting school, observing the resilience she had shown throughout their ordeal, he realized something important had shifted. "I think your mama would be amazed at how strong and brave you've been," he said, sitting on the edge of what would be her bed. "And I think she'd be proud that we didn't give up, even when things got really hard." "Are you going to be a firefighter again?" Lucia asked, the question she had been carrying since learning about his new job. Marklord considered his answer carefully. The position with Technova wasn't firefighting in the traditional sense, but it was emergency services, it was helping people prepare for disasters, it was using his knowledge to protect lives. In some ways, it was exactly what he had been doing in the stairwell of Celestial Towers, applying his expertise to save people who couldn't save themselves. "I'm going to be something like a firefighter," he said. "I'm going to help companies get ready for emergencies so that if something bad happens, people know how to stay safe. It's a different kind of helping, but it's still helping." Lucia nodded with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. "And we get to stay here, in our own place?" "We get to stay here," Marklord confirmed. "This is our home now, Misha, your home." As evening approached, they sat together on the living room floor eating takeout Chinese food, a luxury they hadn't been able to afford in months, and planning how to arrange the furniture that would be delivered the next day. Lucia drew pictures of how she wanted her room to look, complete with a desk for homework and space for new books she hoped to acquire. Marklord's phone rang. Catherine Ashford's name appeared on the caller ID. "I hope I'm not interrupting your first evening," Catherine said when he answered. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're settling." "It's perfect," Marklord replied honestly. "Lucia is already planning her room decoration and talking about making friends at school." "I'm glad. And Marklord, I want you to know that what you've agreed to, this isn't charity. Your expertise in emergency preparedness is exactly what Technova needs. I've been researching corporate disaster response protocols since the fire, and most companies are woefully underprepared for real emergencies." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering practical details about his start date, office location, and initial projects. But underlying the professional discussion was something more personal, the recognition that they were all choosing to trust each other with futures that could easily be derailed by misunderstanding or failed expectations. After ending the call, Marklord found Lucia asleep on the living room floor, curled up with one of her books like a pillow. He carried her to her new bedroom, tucked her into the bed they had made together, and stood for a moment looking at this child who had endured so much with such grace. Through the window he could see the lights of the city where they would build their new life. Somewhere in those lights was Catherine Ashford, probably working late in her executive office, probably thinking about the complex relationship they were all navigating. Somewhere else was Vivian, perhaps reflecting on how a fire had changed her understanding of what mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a job that required him to rebuild professional confidence, a daughter starting school in an unfamiliar environment, the daily work of proving worthy of a second chance. But tonight, for the first time in months, Marklord Barbas fell asleep in a bed that belonged to him, in a home that was truly theirs, with hope that felt as solid as the walls around them. The crossing of the threshold was complete. Now came the harder part, building a life worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. 6 months into his role as emergency preparedness consultant, Marklord had transformed the 20th floor of Technova's headquarters into something that looked more like a mission control center than a typical corporate office. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time data feeds from weather services, seismic monitoring stations, and emergency response agencies throughout California. Scale models of each Technova facility occupied a central table, each building marked with color-coded indicators showing evacuation routes, emergency equipment locations, and structural vulnerabilities. "The quarterly drill results are impressive," Catherine said, reviewing the tablet Marklord had handed her during their weekly briefing. "Response times improved by 40% across all facilities, and employee confidence surveys show people actually feel safer coming to work." Marklord nodded, but his expression remained focused on the larger challenge they were tackling. "The drills are working because we're treating them like real emergencies instead of bureaucratic exercises. But the real test will come when we face an actual crisis." That real test was closer than either of them realized. 3 blocks away, at Meridian Elementary School, Lucia was discovering that integration into normal childhood wasn't quite as simple as she had hoped. The other third graders were kind enough, but they lived in a world of playdates and birthday parties, soccer practice, and music lessons, experiences that felt as foreign to her as speaking a different language. "My dad used to be a firefighter," she had told her classmates during show and tell, holding up the photo of Marklord in his captain's uniform. "He saved people from fires and helped them when they were scared." "Why doesn't he do that anymore?" asked Emma, a girl whose father worked at one of the tech companies downtown. Lucia had struggled to answer that question. How do you explain to 8-year-olds that sometimes people stop being heroes because being a hero hurt too much? How do you describe losing everything without making it sound like failure? "He helps people get ready for emergencies now," she had finally said, "so they know what to do before something scary happens." The truth was more complicated. Lucia understood that her father was rebuilding himself piece by piece, that each day at Technova was both professional success and personal therapy. She watched him leave for work each morning with the same careful attention he had once given to checking their backpack for essential supplies. This job wasn't just employment. It was proof that he could still be the man her mother had fallen in love with. Meanwhile, Vivian Ashford was undergoing her own transformation. The fire at Celestial Towers had shattered her comfortable assumption that wealth could insulate her from life's genuine dangers. She had started volunteering with disaster relief organizations, spending weekends learning basic emergency response skills that her privileged upbringing had never included. "You know you don't have to prove anything to anyone," her mother said during one of their increasingly frequent conversations about Vivian's new interests. "What happened in the fire wasn't your fault." "It's not about fault," Vivian replied, practicing the knots she had learned in her emergency response class. "It's about capability. When that building was burning, I was completely helpless. Marklord saved my life because he had skills I didn't even know existed. I never want to be that helpless again." The relationship between the Ashford and Barbas families had evolved into something neither wealth nor circumstance could have predicted. Lucia spent most Saturday afternoons at the Ashford penthouse, where Vivian had become something between a big sister and a mentor. They would work on homework together, with Vivian helping Lucia navigate subjects like advanced math and science that her irregular education had left gaps in. "Your papa is famous around here," Vivian told Lucia during one of these sessions, gesturing toward the Technova building visible through the penthouse windows. "Half the executives want to steal him for their own companies." "He won't leave," Lucia said with absolute certainty. "Papa doesn't quit things anymore." The comment revealed more insight than an 8-year-old should possess. Lucia had watched her father struggle with guilt and self-doubt for months, had seen him question every decision and second-guess every instinct. But his work at Technova was restoring something essential, the confidence that his judgment could be trusted, that his expertise had value, that his presence made other people safer. That confidence was about to be tested in ways none of them anticipated. The first indication of trouble came through the emergency alert system Marklord had installed throughout Teknova's facilities. A 6.2 magnitude earthquake had struck near Bakersfield, causing widespread power outages and structural damage across the Central Valley. Within minutes, Marklord's office became the coordination center for Teknova's response to the crisis. "We have 3 facilities in the affected zone," Marklord reported to Catherine as emergency data streamed across his monitors. "Fresno, Stockton, and our new research center in Modesto. Initial reports suggest the Modesto facility may have sustained significant damage." Catherine studied the incoming information with the same focused intensity she brought to major business decisions. "What's our protocol?" "Immediate evacuation of all personnel from potentially compromised structures, emergency communication with family members to confirm everyone's safety, and rapid assessment of our ability to continue operations," Marklord replied, his voice carrying the calm authority that had impressed her since their first meeting. "But there's a complication." "What kind of complication?" Marklord highlighted a section of the Modesto facility on his display. "The research center houses the prototype servers for Project Aurora. If those systems are damaged, we lose 18 months of development work and possibly our competitive edge in the quantum computing market." Project Aurora represented Teknova's biggest investment in next-generation technology, the kind of breakthrough that could define the company's future for decades. The servers were housed in a specially designed facility that was supposed to be earthquake-resistant, but supposed to be, and actually is, were different things when the Earth moved in ways engineers hadn't anticipated. "How dangerous would it be to send a team to secure the servers?" Catherine asked. Marklord's expression grew serious. "Depends on the structural integrity of the building. If the earthquake weakened critical supports, another aftershock could cause collapse. We'd need someone with structural assessment training to evaluate the risks. Someone like you." The statement hung in the air between them. Catherine wasn't just asking Marklord to coordinate emergency response from the safety of his office. She was asking him to return to the kind of fieldwork that had cost him everything once before. "I could do the assessment," Marklord said carefully, "but if I recommend evacuation, everyone leaves immediately, regardless of the financial cost." "Agreed." As Marklord prepared for his first emergency response deployment since leaving the fire service, his phone rang. Lucia's school was calling to inform parents about earthquake protocols and early dismissal procedures. "Papa?" Lucia's voice was small when he called her back. "Are you going to help with the earthquake?" "Yes, Mija. I need to make sure some people are safe." "Will you come home?" The question that haunted every emergency responder's family, the fear that lived beneath the surface of every dangerous job. Carmen had asked the same question 100 times, and 99 times he had come home safely. "I will come home," Marklord promised. "Heroes always come home to their children, remember?" 2 hours later, he was on a helicopter flying toward Modesto, equipped with structural assessment tools and the kind of responsibility he hadn't carried since wearing a fire captain's badge. Below them, the earthquake's damage was visible in collapsed overpasses, damaged buildings, and the geometric patterns of emergency response vehicles converging on areas of greatest need. But this time was different. This time he wasn't responding as Captain Barbas, responsible for everything and everyone. He was Marklord Barbas, consultant and expert with a specific mission and clear parameters. He had a daughter waiting for him at home, a job that valued his expertise, and colleagues who trusted his judgment. Most importantly, he had learned the difference between accepting responsibility and accepting blame. As the helicopter approached the Teknova research facility, Marklord could see that the building had indeed sustained damage, cracked walls, shifted foundations, the kind of structural compromise that made every step inside potentially fatal. But he could also see something else. People still inside, probably trying to secure equipment worth millions of dollars. The real test of his rebuilt confidence was about to begin. The helicopter touched down in the parking lot of the Modesto research facility, just as the third aftershock of the day rolled through the Central Valley. Marklord felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the aircraft settled, but this time it was tempered by something that had been missing during his final months as a fire captain. Clarity of purpose without the crushing weight of omnipotent responsibility. Dr. James Chen, the facility's research director, met them at the landing zone with the kind of barely controlled panic that Marklord recognized from countless emergency scenes. The man was torn between scientific rationality and the very human fear of losing work that represented years of his professional life. "Mr. Barbas, thank God you're here," Dr. Chen said over the helicopter's rotor wash. "We managed to evacuate most of the staff, but 3 of our senior engineers refused to leave. They're trying to secure the quantum processing cores before the building becomes completely unstable." Marklord surveyed the research facility with trained eyes, automatically cataloging structural damage and potential failure points. The building was a modern construction, designed to earthquake standards, but the 6.2 magnitude quake had found weaknesses that architects hadn't anticipated. Visible cracks ran along the eastern wall. The main entrance showed signs of frame distortion, and most concerning, the ground around the foundation had settled unevenly. "How critical is this equipment they're trying to save?" Marklord asked, pulling on the protective gear he'd brought from San Francisco. "Project Aurora represents 3 years of development and about $40 million in investment," Dr. Chen replied. "But more than that, it's breakthrough technology. If we lose those processing cores, we lose our competitive advantage in quantum computing for the next decade." Marklord understood the mathematics of corporate crisis, as well as he understood the physics of structural collapse. Catherine had built Technova into a technology leader through calculated risks and strategic investments. Project Aurora was her bet on the future, and its loss would represent more than financial damage. It would signal to competitors and investors that Technova couldn't protect its most valuable assets. But buildings could kill people in ways that market losses couldn't. "I need to assess the structural integrity before anyone else goes inside," Marklord said, shouldering his equipment pack. "If I determine the building is unsafe, those engineers come out immediately, regardless of what they're trying to save." "Understood," Dr. Chen agreed, though his expression suggested he was hoping for a different conclusion. The approach to the building required the kind of careful observation that had kept Marklord alive through hundreds of emergency responses. He tested each step for ground stability, watched for signs of shifting walls or compromised support structures, and listened for the subtle sounds that indicated a building under stress. The lobby showed immediate signs of serious damage. Ceiling tiles had fallen, creating a debris field that suggested the structure above was unstable. More concerning, the elevator shafts showed visible misalignment, evidence that the building's frame had shifted during the earthquake. Marklord's radio crackled with transmission from the trapped engineers. "This is Dr. Sarah Martinez in the server room. We're almost finished with the data transfer, but we need another 20 minutes to secure the hardware." "Dr. Martinez, this is Marklord Barbas, emergency consultant. I'm conducting structural assessment. What's your current location and route to exit?" "3rd floor, eastern section. We're using the service elevator to move equipment to ground-level storage." Marklord felt his blood pressure spike. The service elevator was in the section of the building showing the most obvious structural damage. Using it was like playing Russian roulette with several chambers loaded. "Negative on elevator use," he transmitted immediately. "That section of the building is compromised. You need to evacuate using the western stairwell immediately." "We can't abandon this equipment," Dr. Martinez replied. "Do you understand what this represents?" The familiar tension between immediate safety and broader consequences. The same calculation that had tormented Marklord during his final months as a fire captain. But this time, he had the advantage of specific expertise rather than general responsibility. "Dr. Martinez, I'm coming up to evaluate your situation," Marklord said. "But if I determine immediate evacuation is necessary, you follow my directions without argument. This is about life safety, not corporate assets." The ascent to the 3rd floor became a masterclass in structural assessment under pressure. Each flight of stairs revealed new damage: cracked load-bearing walls, shifted door frames, the subtle signs that indicated a building fighting to hold itself together against forces it wasn't designed to withstand. The server room itself was a testament to both human ingenuity and human stubbornness. Dr. Martinez and her 2 colleagues had managed to transfer critical data to portable storage, while simultaneously attempting to disconnect and package the quantum processing cores. The equipment represented the cutting edge of computing technology, but it was housed in a room where ceiling supports were visibly sagging. "Dr. Martinez," Marklord said as he entered the server room, "you have accomplished remarkable work under dangerous conditions. But this building is going to come down, probably in the next significant aftershock." "How long do we have?" she asked, not stopping her work on the quantum cores. Marklord checked his seismic monitoring app. "Aftershocks are occurring every 15 to 20 minutes. The last one was 12 minutes ago." As if summoned by his words, the building began to shake again. This aftershock was stronger than the previous ones, and Marklord watched with professional horror as the server room's ceiling began to bow visibly downward. "Everyone out now," he commanded, using the voice that had once cleared burning buildings of hesitant victims. "Leave everything and move to the western stairwell immediately." The three engineers looked at their life's work, at equipment worth millions of dollars, at technology that could define their careers. Then they looked at Marklord Barbas, homeless man turned emergency consultant, whose calm authority in the face of mortal danger reminded them that some things were more valuable than innovation. They left everything and ran. The evacuation from the third floor became a race against structural failure. Marklord led the group through corridors that were shifting visibly, past windows that had cracked during the aftershock, down stairs that groaned under loads they were no longer designed to bear. The building's coming apart, Dr. Martinez observed with the clinical detachment of someone whose adrenaline had moved beyond panic into professional clarity. "Buildings are designed to fail gradually," Marklord replied, guiding them around a section of collapsed ceiling. "The question is whether we can get out before gradually becomes catastrophically." The western stairwell proved to be their salvation. This section of the building had sustained less damage, probably due to different soil conditions or superior construction. They descended steadily, the sounds of structural stress echoing around them like the groans of a wounded animal. Ground level brought the relief of solid earth and open sky, but also the reality of what they had left behind. Project Aurora's quantum processing cores, representing years of development and millions in investment, remained in a building that might not survive the next aftershock. "I'm sorry," Marklord said to Dr. Chen as they reached the parking lot. "The building is too unstable to risk further recovery operations." Dr. Chen nodded, his expression carrying the weight of professional disappointment mixed with personal relief. "You made the right call. Equipment can be replaced. People can't." As they waited for transportation back to San Francisco, Marklord's phone buzzed with messages from Catherine, from Vivian, and, most importantly, from Lucia's school, confirming she had been picked up safely by Mrs. Chen. "Papa?" Lucia's voice was small when he called her. "Did you help people with the earthquake?" "I helped some people get out of a dangerous building," Marklord replied, "and I'm coming home now." "Are you sad about the building?" The question revealed how well his daughter understood him. Yes, he was sad about the building, about the lost equipment, about the setback to Technova's ambitious plans. But he was also proud that he had made the right decision under pressure, proud that his expertise had saved lives, proud that he had trusted his judgment without being paralyzed by the fear of being wrong. "I'm sad about what was lost," he told Lucia, "but I'm proud that everyone came home safe." As the helicopter lifted off from Modesto, carrying them back toward San Francisco and whatever consequences awaited, Marklord realized something fundamental had changed. The earthquake had been his first real test since rejoining the world of emergency response, and he had passed it, not because he had saved the equipment or prevented all losses, but because he had made decisions based on expertise rather than fear, on professional judgment rather than personal guilt. The major setback that had threatened to destroy his newfound confidence had instead proven that his confidence was built on solid ground. But the real test of how Catherine Ashford would respond to losing $40 million worth of equipment was still ahead. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 6 a.m., an ungodly hour that reflected both the urgency of Technova's situation and Catherine Ashford's recognition that crisis management couldn't wait for convenient schedules. Marklord arrived at the corporate headquarters while San Francisco was still wrapped in pre-dawn darkness, his emergency response gear replaced by the kind of business attire that felt foreign after months of focusing purely on practical function. The 20th floor buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with $40 million in lost assets. Senior executives huddled in small groups, their conversations carried out in the hushed tones that accompanied corporate catastrophe. Marklord could feel their eyes on him as he passed. Some curious, some sympathetic, but more than a few openly hostile. "There's our hero," came a voice from behind him. Richard Blackstone, Technova's chief financial officer, approached with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "I hear you made quite a decision yesterday." Marklord had been expecting this conversation since the helicopter touched down the previous evening. Blackstone represented old-school corporate thinking, the kind of executive who measured success purely in quarterly returns, and saw emergency preparedness as an expensive form of insurance that hopefully would never be used. "I made the decision that kept 3 people alive," Marklord replied evenly. "That was my job." "Your job was to assess risk and provide options," Blackstone countered. "Instead, you made a unilateral decision that cost this company its most valuable research asset." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything Marklord had rebuilt over the past 6 months. He understood the mathematics of the situation. Project Aurora's quantum processing cores represented not just money, but competitive advantage, market position, and the technological leadership that justified Teknova's premium valuation. "Richard," Catherine's voice cut through the tension with surgical precision, "I believe our board meeting is about to begin." The boardroom felt like a courtroom where Marklord was simultaneously the key witness and the defendant. 12 of Silicon Valley's most powerful executives sat around a table that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical about the homeless man who had somehow positioned himself at the center of their corporate crisis. Catherine took her place at the head of the table with the calm authority that had built Teknova from a startup into a technology giant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address the loss of Project Aurora's processing cores and determine our path forward. Marklord, please provide your assessment of yesterday's events." For the next 20 minutes, Marklord presented his structural analysis with the same methodical precision he had once used to brief fire department commanders. He displayed photographs of the earthquake damage, explained the engineering principles that had guided his decision-making, and walked the board through the timeline that had led to evacuation rather than equipment recovery. The building sustained critical structural damage that made continued occupation life-threatening, he concluded. Any attempt to recover equipment would have required personnel to work in spaces where ceiling collapse was imminent. But the equipment itself might have been recoverable if we had taken different risks, Blackstone interjected. Other companies have successfully salvaged valuable assets from damaged buildings. Other companies have also lost personnel attempting such recoveries, Marklord replied. The question isn't whether the equipment could have been saved. The question is whether saving it was worth risking human lives. Board member Patricia Williams, who had built her reputation in biotechnology before joining Teknova, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mr. Barbas, in your professional experience, what's the relationship between equipment losses and personnel safety in emergency situations?" The question touched on everything Marklord had learned during his years as a fire captain. Lessons written in smoke and measured in lives saved or lost. Equipment can always be rebuilt or replaced. The knowledge, relationships, and human capital that create valuable equipment, that's irreplaceable. Dr. Martinez and her team represent decades of combined experience in quantum computing. Losing them would have set Project Aurora back years, not months. "Assuming we can rebuild the processing cores at all," Blackstone muttered. "Some of those components had manufacturing lead times of 8 months. Catherine had been quiet throughout most of the discussion, but now she spoke with the kind of measured authority that reminded everyone why she occupied the CEO chair. "Richard raises valid concerns about our timeline and competitive position. However, I want to address something more fundamental about corporate responsibility and crisis management." She activated the room's display system, showing news footage from the previous day's earthquake response. Emergency vehicles, damaged buildings, and most prominently, interviews with grateful families whose loved ones had been safely evacuated from various facilities throughout the affected region. "Yesterday's earthquake was a test of our corporate values under pressure," Catherine continued. "It would have been easy to prioritize asset recovery over personnel safety, especially when those assets represent such significant investment. But our response to this crisis will define Teknova's reputation for decades." Board member Michael Torres, whose venture capital firm had been among Teknova's earliest investors, nodded thoughtfully. "Catherine's right. How we handle crisis management affects everything from employee retention to regulatory relationships. The optics of losing equipment are manageable. The optics of losing people are not. Plus," added Williams, "we're talking about quantum processing cores, not irreplaceable research data. The intellectual property, the development methodologies, the team expertise, all of that survived yesterday intact. We can rebuild the hardware." Marklord watched this discussion unfold with growing recognition that something larger than his individual decision was being evaluated. These executives were wrestling with fundamental questions about corporate priorities, risk tolerance, and the relationship between financial success and human responsibility. "There's something else to consider," Catherine said, pulling up financial projections on the display. "Our insurance coverage for earthquake damage is comprehensive, including business interruption protection. The actual financial impact of losing the processing cores is significant, but manageable." Blackstone's expression shifted as he processed this information. "How manageable?" "Manageable enough that we can rebuild Project Aurora without compromising our other development timelines or market position," Catherine replied. "What we couldn't have managed was the legal, regulatory, and reputational consequences of personnel casualties caused by prioritizing equipment over safety." The room fell quiet as board members contemplated scenarios they preferred not to imagine: wrongful death lawsuits, regulatory investigations, media coverage focusing on corporate negligence rather than natural disaster. "So where does this leave us moving forward?" asked Torres. Catherine looked directly at Marklord, her expression carrying something he couldn't quite identify: approval, perhaps, or recognition that had nothing to do with corporate hierarchies. "It leaves us with an emergency preparedness consultant who demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment we hired him to provide," she said. "Yesterday's decision reflected our corporate values under pressure. Marklord made the choice that preserved our most valuable assets, our people and our reputation." The vote to continue Project Aurora's rebuilding was unanimous. The vote to expand Marklord's role in corporate emergency planning was nearly so, with only Blackstone abstaining rather than opposing. As board members filed out of the room, discussing implementation timelines and budget allocations, Catherine approached Marklord with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal pride. "You know," she said quietly, "yesterday was about more than just earthquake response. It was about proving that our partnership can survive real pressure." Marklord understood what she meant. The fire at Celestial Towers had brought them together, but corporate crisis had tested whether their alliance could endure when substantial money was at stake. "Thank you for backing my decision," he said. "I know it wasn't easy to support losing that much investment." Catherine smiled, not the practiced expression she used in business meetings, but the genuine warmth of someone who had watched a friend pass a difficult test. "Marklord, the best investment I ever made wasn't in quantum computing technology. It was in recognizing that real leadership means surrounding yourself with people who will make the right decisions, even when they're difficult." As they prepared to leave the boardroom, Marklord's phone buzzed with a text from Lucia. "Papa, Mrs. Chen says you were on the news. Are you famous now?" Famous wasn't the right word, but something had definitely changed. Yesterday's earthquake had tested not just his professional competence, but his ability to maintain his principles under corporate pressure. The homeless single father who had pulled a CEO's daughter from a burning building had evolved into something new: a trusted advisor whose judgment carried weight in boardrooms and emergency zones alike. The real ordeal was behind them, but the transformation it had catalyzed was just beginning. 2 years after the earthquake that had tested both his professional judgment and personal resolve, Marklord found himself standing in the conference room of the newly constructed Technova Emergency Response Center, watching a wall of monitors display real-time data from what meteorologists were calling the most dangerous wildfire season in California history. The Cascade Fire had already consumed 150,000 acres across 3 counties, and satellite imagery showed it bearing down on the Central Valley with unprecedented speed and intensity. Latest projections show the fire will reach the Fresno metropolitan area within 18 hours, reported Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the emergency management specialist Marklord had hired 6 months earlier. "We're looking at potential evacuation of nearly 500,000 people, including our 3 major facilities in the region." The Emergency Response Center represented everything Marklord had learned about translating corporate resources into genuine disaster preparedness. Instead of treating emergency planning as a bureaucratic exercise, Technova had become a model for how private sector expertise could support public safety. The center coordinated not just with their own facilities, but with county emergency services, the National Weather Service, and evacuation organizations throughout California. "What's our current personnel status in the affected zones?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying the calm authority that had guided Technova through multiple crises over the past 2 years. "All non-essential personnel evacuated from Fresno and Stockton facilities as of this morning," Marklord replied, consulting the tablet that had become his constant companion during emergency operations. critical systems are operating on automated protocols with remote monitoring from our San Francisco headquarters. The transformation in both Marklord and Catherine was evident to anyone who had known them before the fire at Celestial Towers. He had evolved from a homeless single father struggling with guilt and loss into a nationally recognized expert in corporate emergency management. She had moved beyond the traditional CEO role to become an advocate for business community responsibility and disaster response. There's a complication, Dr. Rodriguez continued, highlighting a section of the digital map on the main display. The Riverside County Children's Hospital is directly in the fire's path. They're attempting to evacuate, but they have 37 children who can't be moved through conventional methods. Premature infants, kids on life support, patients recovering from major surgery. Marklord felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied life or death decisions. The hospital was outside Technova's direct area of responsibility, but it was exactly the kind of situation where corporate resources could mean the difference between successful evacuation and tragic loss. What kind of support do they need? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Specialized transport vehicles that can maintain power for medical equipment during evacuation, Dr. Rodriguez replied. The hospital's ambulances can't handle the most critical cases, and the county's emergency services are already overwhelmed with general population evacuation. Catherine looked at Marklord with an expression he had learned to recognize, the moment when personal values intersected with corporate capabilities to create opportunity for extraordinary action. Do we have the resources to help? She asked. We have the prototype mobile medical units that were developed for Project Phoenix, Marklord replied, referring to Technova's expansion into emergency response technology. They're designed exactly for this kind of situation, maintaining power and environmental control for critical medical equipment during transport. Project Phoenix had emerged from Marklord's earthquake experience as Technova's venture into disaster response innovation. Using the quantum computing expertise that had been temporarily lost in Modesto, they had developed mobile units that could provide hospital-grade power and communication support in emergency situations. How quickly can we deploy them? Catherine asked. 2 hours to reach Riverside County, Marklord said, already mental calculating logistics. But this isn't just about equipment deployment. Those mobile units require trained operators, and we'd be inserting our people into an active fire zone. The decision point had arrived, the moment that would test whether Technova's commitment to emergency response extended beyond their own facilities and personnel into genuine community service. Marklord, Catherine said quietly, what's your professional assessment of the risks? He appreciated that she was asking for expertise rather than making an emotional decision. 2 years of working together had taught them both to separate personal feelings from operational judgment. High risk, manageable with proper precautions, Marklord replied. The fire is moving fast, but predictably. We'd have a clear evacuation window if we position our teams correctly. The bigger question is whether we're prepared to take responsibility for medical transport of critically ill children. What would you need to make it work? Marklord activated his emergency contact system, sending priority alerts to the specialized team he had assembled for exactly this kind of situation. Dr. Patterson for medical oversight, Martinez for equipment operations, Chen for communication coordination, and I'd lead the field team personally. You're going into the field yourself? Catherine's question carried notes of both professional concern and personal worry that had developed over their months of collaboration. This operation requires split-second coordination between medical and emergency response protocols, Marklord explained. I am the only person on our team with experience in both areas. What he didn't say was that 2 years of desk work had left him hungry for the kind of hands-on emergency response that had originally defined his professional identity. The earthquake had proven he could still make critical decisions under pressure, but this fire offered something more, the chance to actively save lives rather than just prevent losses. Lucia, Catherine said, recognizing the unspoken concern that underlay every dangerous assignment. She's in school? Safe at Meridian Elementary with instructions to go to your penthouse if needed, Marklord replied. Mrs. Chen has backup guardian authorization. The logistics of single parenthood in emergency response work had required careful planning and multiple contingencies. Lucia, now 10 years old, understood that her father's job sometimes involved helping people in dangerous situations, but she also knew that her safety was always his primary consideration. Deploy the mobile units, Catherine decided, full authorization for emergency expenditures and personnel assignment. As Marklord prepared for what would be his most complex field operation since joining Technova, his phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source, Vivian Ashford, who had completed her emergency medical technician certification 6 months earlier. Saw the news about the Children's Hospital. If you need additional medical support, I'm available. The offer surprised and touched him. Vivian had transformed from the helpless victim he had rescued from Celestial Towers into a capable emergency responder who regularly volunteered with disaster relief organizations. Her presence on the team would add both medical expertise and a personal connection that might prove valuable in the challenging hours ahead. "Meet us at the helicopter pad in 30 minutes, he texted back. "This is going to be dangerous." "Dangerous is what we train for," came her immediate reply. As Marklord gathered his emergency gear and reviewed evacuation protocols, he realized that this fire represented more than just another emergency response. It was the convergence of everything that had developed from that moment 2 years ago when he had climbed the stairs of a burning building to save a stranger's daughter. The relationships forged in crisis, the expertise rebuilt through second chances, the corporate resources redirected toward community service. All of it was about to be tested in conditions that would leave no room for hesitation or doubt. 37 children were counting on them to succeed, and failure wasn't an option that any of them could accept. The helicopter engines were already spinning up as Marklord headed toward the roof, carrying equipment that might save lives and carrying the weight of responsibility that he had finally learned to bear with confidence rather than fear. This was the ordeal that would prove whether all their preparation had been sufficient, whether their partnership could withstand the ultimate test of emergency response under impossible conditions. The real test was about to begin. The Riverside County Children's Hospital sat like an island of desperate hope in a landscape that looked increasingly like the surface of an alien planet. Smoke had turned the afternoon sky an apocalyptic orange, and ash fell like snow across the parking lot where Technova's mobile medical units were being positioned with military precision. The fire was now less than 8 miles away, moving at speeds that defied every computer model the emergency services had relied upon. Final count is 37 children requiring specialized transport. Dr. Sarah Patterson reported through her headset as she coordinated with the hospital's medical staff. 12 on ventilators, 8 in incubators, 17 with critical medication regimens that can't be interrupted. Marklord surveyed the evacuation zone from the mobile command center they had established in the hospital's emergency bay. 2 years of corporate emergency planning had prepared him for complex logistics, but nothing had quite prepared him for the emotional weight of seeing critically ill children being prepared for transport through an active fire zone. "Transport timeline?" he asked Dr. Martinez, who was running final systems checks on the mobile units. 15 minutes per unit to reach the receiving hospital in San Bernardino, Martinez replied. "That gives us a 3-hour window to complete all transports before the fire reaches this location." 3 hours sounded like plenty of time until you factored in the complexities of moving children whose lives depended on uninterrupted medical support. Each transport required careful coordination between Technova's equipment operators, the hospital's medical team, and emergency services clearing their route through increasingly chaotic evacuation traffic. Vivian emerged from the pediatric intensive care unit wearing the kind of focused expression Marklord had learned to associate with people discovering their true capabilities under pressure. Her EMT training had prepared her for medical emergencies, but this was her first experience with disaster-scale evacuation. "The nursing staff says some of these kids have been here for months," she reported. "They're scared about leaving the only place that feels safe to them." The comment highlighted an aspect of emergency response that training manuals rarely addressed: the psychological trauma of displacement, especially for children whose medical conditions had already isolated them from normal life experiences. "How are you handling it?" Marklord asked, recognizing signs of emotional strain that he'd seen in countless emergency responders facing their first major disaster. "I keep thinking about that day in Celestial Towers," Vivian replied. "How you stayed calm even when everything was falling apart. These kids need us to be that calm for them." The first transport left the hospital at 2:47 p.m., carrying 4 premature infants whose incubators had been seamlessly integrated into Technova's mobile medical unit. Marklord watched the convoy disappear into the smoke-hazed distance, carrying responsibility that felt heavier than any equipment he had ever managed. Unit 1 reporting successful departure, came Dr. Patterson's voice over the radio. "All patient vitals stable, estimated arrival at San Bernardino in 18 minutes. But even as the first transport achieved success, new complications were emerging. The fire's behavior had changed, driven by wind patterns that meteorologists hadn't predicted. Instead of moving steadily northeast, it had begun to spread in multiple directions, creating the kind of unpredictable threat that turned routine evacuations into survival scenarios. "Command, this is Fire Chief Reynolds," came a voice over the emergency frequency. "We're seeing rapid-fire advancement from multiple vectors. All evacuation operations need to accelerate immediately." Marklord felt the familiar sensation of time compression that accompanied high-stakes emergency response. Decisions that normally required careful consideration now had to be made in seconds, with incomplete information and consequences that could ripple through dozens of lives. "Dr. Martinez, can we reduce transport intervals?" he asked. 15-minute intervals are already pushing safety margins," Martinez replied. These mobile units weren't designed for continuous operation under these conditions. The tension between speed and safety, the calculation that had haunted every major decision Marklord had made since returning to emergency response work. Pushed too hard and equipment failed, people made mistakes, systems collapsed under pressure. Moved too slowly, and the fire made the choice for everyone. Unit 2 preparing for departure, Dr. Patterson announced, 8 children, including 2 on life support. Through the mobile command center's windows, Marklord could see the second convoy loading patients with the controlled urgency that marked experienced medical professionals working under pressure. Each child represented someone's entire world. Parents who had spent sleepless nights in hospital chairs, siblings who missed their brother or sister, families whose universe had contracted to the size of a pediatric hospital room. "Unit 1 has arrived safely at San Bernardino," came the radio update that provided temporary relief. "All patients transferred successfully, equipment functioning normally." But success was measured in increments, and they still had 29 children waiting for transport through conditions that were deteriorating by the minute. "Marklord," Vivian approached with news that changed everything. "There's a problem with the evacuation route. Highway 215 is blocked by accident debris, and the alternate routes are jammed with civilian evacuation traffic." The transportation bottleneck that every emergency planner feared. Too many people trying to leave through too few safe passages. In normal circumstances, traffic management was someone else's responsibility. But when children's lives depended on maintaining transport schedules, normal circumstances became irrelevant. "Options?" Marklord asked, his mind already working through alternatives that ranged from difficult to dangerous. "Medical helicopter evacuation for the most critical cases," Vivian suggested. "But the smoke conditions are marginal for flight operations." "Ground transport using emergency service routes that bypass civilian traffic," Dr. Martinez added. "But that requires coordination with multiple agencies and assumes the fire doesn't cut off those routes." Marklord looked at the wall display showing real-time fire progression. Red zones indicated active burning, orange showed areas under immediate threat, yellow marked evacuation zones. The hospital sat in orange territory that was rapidly shifting toward red. "We do both," he decided. "Helicopter evacuation for children who can't survive extended ground transport, emergency route clearance for the mobile units, and we compress our timeline to 90 minutes for complete evacuation." "That's extremely aggressive," Dr. Patterson warned over the radio. "We're talking about minimal safety margins." "The fire isn't offering us conservative options," Marklord replied. "We adapt to the conditions we have, not the conditions we want." As Unit 2 departed with its precious cargo, Marklord found himself thinking about Lucia, safe in her classroom at Meridian Elementary, probably working on math problems that had predictable solutions and reliable answers. Emergency response work meant operating in a world where the variables constantly changed, and the only certainty was uncertainty. "Unit 3 loading now," Dr. Patterson reported. "This group includes the most medically fragile patients if anything goes wrong." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that some of these children existed at the intersection of medical miracle and technological intervention. Disrupting their care for even minutes could trigger cascading failures that no amount of expertise could reverse. Unit 2 reporting successful arrival came the radio update that marked another small victory. 17 children safely evacuated. But with the fire advancing faster than projected and 20 children still awaiting transport, success was starting to feel like a race they might not win. "Marklord," Catherine's voice came through his satellite phone. calling from the Technova command center where she was monitoring their progress. Emergency services are reporting that you may need to consider partial evacuation options. The suggestion that haunted every emergency responder, the possibility that saving everyone might not be possible, that success might be measured in lives saved rather than lives completely protected. Not an option, Marklord replied with the quiet certainty that had carried him through every crisis since Celestial Towers. We didn't come here to save some of these children. We came here to save all of them. As Unit 3 disappeared into the smoke-filled distance, carrying its cargo of hope and medical miracles, Marklord Barbas prepared for the final phase of an operation that would either prove his transformation complete or test whether he had truly learned to carry the weight of other people's lives. The victory he was fighting for lay just ahead, but the margin for error had disappeared entirely. 5 years had passed since the last child was evacuated from Riverside County Children's Hospital. 5 years since Marklord Barbas had discovered that heroism wasn't about perfect decisions made in impossible circumstances, but about refusing to abandon hope when others needed you most. Now he stood before an audience of 500 emergency management professionals at the International Conference on Corporate Disaster Response, delivering the keynote address that would cap a transformation none of them could have imagined. The Barbas Protocol, as it had come to be known in emergency management circles, represented a fundamental shift in how private sector resources could be mobilized for public safety. What had begun as one homeless father's desperate attempt to save a stranger's daughter had evolved into a comprehensive framework for corporate emergency response that was being implemented by companies across 3 continents. Emergency preparedness isn't about having the perfect plan, Marklord told the assembled audience of executives, emergency responders, and policymakers. It's about building systems that can adapt when plans inevitably encounter realities they didn't anticipate. In the audience, 13-year-old Lucia watched her father with the kind of quiet pride that belonged to children who had seen their parents rebuild themselves from nothing. She understood, in ways most teenagers couldn't, that the confident professional speaking from the podium was the same man who had once slept in doorways and counted quarters to buy her breakfast. Beside Lucia sat Catherine Ashford, whose own transformation had been nearly as dramatic as Marklord's. Technova had become the model for how technology companies could leverage their resources for social good without compromising their business objectives. The emergency response division she had created now generated substantial revenue, while providing critical services to communities across the disaster-prone American West. The children's hospital evacuation succeeded because we stopped treating emergency response as someone else's responsibility, Marklord continued, clicking to a slide that showed the mobile medical units that had become standard equipment for disaster response organizations worldwide. Every corporation has resources that could save lives in the right circumstances. The question is whether we choose to see those resources as assets or as obligations. Vivian Ashford Martinez, who had kept her maiden name professionally, but married Dr. Elena Martinez 2 years earlier, watched from the side of the auditorium where she was coordinating with conference organizers. Her journey from helpless victim to certified paramedic to emergency response coordinator had become its own inspiration story, frequently cited in training programs for disaster relief volunteers. The statistics Marklord presented were impressive by any measure. The Barbas Protocol had been instrumental in successful evacuations of over 50,000 people across dozens of natural disasters. Corporate adoption of enhanced emergency preparedness had reduced disaster-related casualties by 37% in participating companies. More importantly, it had created a cultural shift in how businesses understood their role during community crises. But numbers don't tell the complete story, Marklord said, advancing to a slide showing photographs from various emergency responses over the past 5 years. Emergency management is ultimately about people helping people when systems fail and circumstances become desperate. One photograph showed Mrs. Chen, now 78 years old but still running her corner store in Meridian Heights, serving free coffee to evacuees during last year's earthquake. Another captured Dr. Sarah Patterson leading a medical team through the aftermath of Hurricane Patricia. A third showed the rebuilt Technova research facility in Modesto, now equipped with the most advanced earthquake-resistant construction techniques available. The most important lesson we've learned, Marklord continued, is that expertise and resources can come from unexpected places. Some of our most innovative solutions have come from people who were overlooked by traditional emergency management systems. In the front row, Fire Chief Sarah Rodriguez nodded approvingly. She had been promoted to Regional Emergency Services Director, based largely on her successful integration of private sector resources into public safety operations. The partnership model pioneered by Technova had become the standard for corporate government cooperation in disaster response. Which brings me to our newest initiative, Marklord said, revealing a slide that generated murmurs of interest throughout the auditorium. The Phoenix Institute for Emergency Innovation. The Phoenix Institute represented the culmination of everything Marklord and Catherine had learned about transforming individual expertise into systemic change. Located in a rebuilt section of downtown Oakland, the Institute trained emergency responders from around the world while conducting research into innovative disaster preparedness technologies. Traditional emergency management training focuses on responding to disasters after they occur, Marklord explained. The Phoenix Institute takes a different approach. We train people to recognize and address vulnerabilities before they become catastrophes. The Institute's most innovative program trained formerly homeless individuals in emergency response skills, recognizing that people who had survived on society's margins possessed valuable knowledge about resource scarcity, creative problem-solving, and maintaining hope under impossible circumstances. Some of our most effective emergency coordinators are people who understand what it means to have nowhere safe to go, Marklord said. They bring perspectives that traditional training can't replicate. As his presentation neared its conclusion, Marklord found himself thinking about the circuitous path that had led from that morning in Celestial Towers to this moment of professional recognition and personal fulfillment. The homeless single father who had been dismissed by a security guard was now advising federal agencies on disaster preparedness policy. "I want to close with something personal," he said, departing from his prepared remarks. 6 years ago, I was sleeping in a van with my daughter, convinced that my life's useful purpose had ended. I believed that losing my wife meant losing my identity as someone who helped other people. The auditorium fell silent, as 500 professionals listened to a vulnerability that transformed statistics into human truth. The fire at Celestial Towers taught me that heroism isn't about wearing the right uniform or having the right credentials. It's about recognizing that your skills, your knowledge, your willingness to act, these things have value regardless of your circumstances. Marklord looked toward Lucia, who was watching him with the same mixture of love and pride that had sustained them through their darkest months. "My daughter used to ask me if I missed being a firefighter. I told her I would always be a firefighter, even when I wasn't wearing the badge. Today, I can say that our entire community has learned to be firefighters. Not literally, but in the sense that we've all accepted responsibility for each other's safety." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Marklord barely noticed it. His attention was focused on the text message that had just arrived from the California Emergency Management Agency. Major earthquake predicted for Northern California within 72 hours. Request immediate deployment of Phoenix Institute Rapid Response Team. As conference attendees filed out discussing implementation strategies and partnership opportunities, Marklord gathered his family, because that's what they had become, this unlikely collection of people whose lives had intersected in a burning building and grown into something stronger than any of them could have built alone. "New emergency?" Catherine asked, recognizing the expression that meant Marklord was already shifting into crisis management mode. "Major earthquake incoming," he replied. "Probably the biggest test we've faced." Lucia, now a teenager who had grown up understanding that her father's work sometimes meant running toward danger instead of away from it, simply nodded. "How many people will need help?" "Maybe 1 million, Marklord said honestly. "Then we better get to work," Vivian added, already pulling up emergency contact lists on her phone. As they left the conference center and headed toward whatever crisis awaited, Marklord reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. The homeless man who had saved a billionaire's daughter was gone, replaced by someone who understood that salvation was always mutual, that in the act of rescuing others, we rescue ourselves. But more than that, he had learned that the most powerful transformations weren't individual achievements but collective ones. The real success wasn't that Marklord Barbas had rebuilt his life, but that their entire community had learned to see beyond surface circumstances, to recognize the heroism that lived in unexpected places. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to care for each other. But tonight, Marklord Barbas was going home to prepare dinner for his daughter in the kitchen of a house they owned in a life they had built together from the ashes of everything they had lost. Sometimes the most important rescue is learning that heroes come home to the people who need them most. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that home isn't a place. It's the certainty that someone will always come looking for you when you're lost in the smoke. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.